This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After Class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Today we're going to be talking about two extensive books, so our news time is going to be shortened. We're just going to say, hey, what'd you do last week? And I'll start. I went to Pittsburgh with two of my buddies. We've been doing a retreat for about 10 years now, and we decided to go to different places, and then now we're trying to go to different baseball parks and watch a baseball game.
Oh, cool.
So we watched the Pirates play the Dodgers, and also got to see Shohei Ohtani, which was fun. He went 1 for 5, which was disappointing, but nonetheless, it was a fun game to watch, and we got a foul ball. So it was it was a good time. Yep.
Nice.
It came flying our way. My buddy basically knocked a guy out of the way, so he missed it, and it fell under my feet. So I just picked it up and handed it to him.
Oh, wow.
Awesome.
So body check the dude.
Yeah,
Huh?
basically.
Wow. That's great.
So
I've
good time.
never caught a ball at a major league game.
No, neither have
Just
I.
at Lugnut Stadium, I caught a couple,
Nice.
but that's just minor league stuff in town.
Yeah, big time.
Pretty cool.
We kept celebrating Suzanne's birthday. Her birthday fell on a Wednesday, but we had a really busy day that day, so we acknowledged it. Next day, we celebrated it. Following day, we celebrated it again. So it was almost like the week of Suzanne. And so just a lot of birthday celebration for her. And we're getting ready to head to the UP. We got to go up to the Great White North and do some work up there. So a little bit of time away from Lansing for this week.
So it's not the summer of George, but it sounds pretty good for Suzanne.
So far, it's been the summer of Suzanne, as it should be. She is worthy of that. So,
Big thing happened with us this week is my youngest daughter and her husband moved in with us. So we did a lot of getting the room ready for them and a total paint job and all that jazz, and then getting them packed up and moved over. And it's been kind of fun that they're going to be here this summer. I mean, she's gearing up to start nursing school and stuff like that. But they're both Yankees fans, and I'm a Yankees fan.
good for you.
And right now, there are very few Yankee fans in Michigan that are in my life. So it's very nice to be able to watch a baseball game. So I've been able to watch some games and hang out together and catch some games during a season where the Yankees are doing incredible, like the best team in the majors right now. So
Nice.
The team that's as good is the Dodgers.
Right.
The team you saw. And interestingly, I think starting this week, now that they just finished against the Twins, they play the Dodgers. So the best two
That'd be
teams
great.
are kind of
Oh,
going
wow.
at it. I'm hoping Shohei Ohtani has another bad week.
Yeah. It doesn't matter, but we went to the game that was 1-0, which is exciting. The next day, he hit a home run. It was 10-6, tons of scoring the day we didn't go, but that's fine.
Of course, yeah.
Sad thing, though, Juan Soto, our new superstar we picked up, who's been carrying us when Judge isn't carrying us, had a forearm injury yesterday.
Oh, no.
So we're going in a little bit handicapped. But there's this stud in the minor leagues that they might be bringing up to take his place. So he's also someone who mashes the ball. So anyway, I'm thinking a lot about baseball because I finally have a team that's doing well.
Right.
And it's been a long time. All my sports, my teams are doing horrible.
Yeah.
Yankees have been under the radar for over a decade. And so finally they're back on top. And it's an exciting time.
It was like being a Lions fan this last year. Finally had a good team.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I understand completely.
And my wife and I and some friends saw Nate Bargatze this
Hilarious.
week, a comedy show in Grand Rapids. Yeah, he's great. So that was a good time. So all right, that's it. We told you limited news. We're going to get right to it. We're doing 2 more apocryphal books, books from the Apocrypha, I should say. These 2 are wisdom books.
Yes.
Kind of along the lines of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Song. Well, more Proverbs, Ecclesiastes
Yes.
but they're 2 big wisdom books in the Apocrypha, and we thought we would just hit them both in one episode because we don't want to wear everyone out with intertestament literature stuff when you're not all that interested. So we're going to talk about
Making some assumptions there, but
Ben
probably right.
Sira, which Sam's going to lead us in, and then the second half of the episode, I'm going to do the Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah.
Take it away, Sam.
Yeah, we start with Ben Sira, which actually has 3 names. It's Ben Sira in Hebrew, which means son of Sira. In Greek, it's called Sirach.
Yep.
And in Latin, it's called Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes.
Right.
Right.
Right? Ecclesiasticus means something like church book in the Latin.
The Book of the Assembly.
Yes. And so, any of those 3, I'll probably go across all of them all in this episode. But yes, Ben Sira, Sirach, Ecclesiasticus.
And sometimes there's a combined title.
Yeah.
The Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach.
Yes. Yeah. a lot.
So that's the original Greek and Old Latin title, which is the longest title in the world.
Yeah, but seemingly it's this fella Simon or whatever who's writing this, or Jesus. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. It's not
Yeshua.
not Jesus of like
Nazareth.
New Testament fame.
Right.
Different one. Yeah, Jesus, Eliezer, etc. And this is actually the first Jewish book we have a clear author. Like, that's the thing people assume, like, oh, it's called Daniel, so Daniel must have written it, which that's clearly not the case.
Yeah.
This is like one of the very few books that this is the guy who actually wrote it. So it's kind of a cool thing. But it was widely read, widely referenced. It was written probably sometime 190 to 180-ish, right before Antiochus IV Epiphanes and all that business and the Maccabean Revolt. Most of it was written in that time period, but there's also what we call a prologue written by the grandson, probably, and he dates that to the 38th year of Ptolemy IV, which is, probably 132-ish, right? So two main parts, but the majority of it is written just before Antiochus IV.
So originally written in Hebrew, and then translated by his grandson.
Yes.
And given a little preface to explain that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're right. This is kind of odd in that we're given this process of authorship and translation and the different names of different parties involved. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. It's a Hebrew book, but there are hints of Greek every once in a while, and at the same time, it's like kind of anti-Greek. It's very interesting. I think an interesting book. I love it, by the way. It's one of my favorite apocryphal books, and if you have not read it, you should. It's long.
It is long.
50-ish chapters, but it's easy reading. It's like reading Proverbs at times, like you said.
Yep.
There's like these little, cute's the wrong word, but like sort of wisdom type sayings.
It's adorable.
It's precious, and it's good, and it's good stuff. It's saying like, oh, I could have read that in Proverbs easily.
Yeah.
It's just things like, oh, this makes sense. This is wisdom ideas. I guess we just hop into it, unless there's any other preface you want to talk about.
Where do you think he got his wisdom from? Like, how did this guy acquire his wisdom?
I think so. Wisdom exists in all cultures, right?
Right, yeah.
And so we have Proverbs, but you see, even in Proverbs, they have taken from other places like Egypt.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a amalgamation of wisdom, but also he's viewing it, and this is something that we can talk about. He's sort of tweaking it now, kind of through a lens of Torah.
Okay,
Right.
yeah.
And so it's taking this wisdom literature, but you've got to interpret it through Torah, where you don't see that in Proverbs. It doesn't talk about Torah. It just talks about this is right, this is wrong, this is wise, this is foolish. Now he's saying yes because of Torah. And so I think it's maybe bringing in other cultural wisdom literature, but definitely refining it.
Yeah, that's the hallmark of wisdom literature. It is eclectic.
Yeah.
It's not like I wrote all of this.
Right. There's no ownership.
Yeah, this is my collection, and I'm framing it and organizing it and putting my own spin on the arrangement to convey what I'm trying to convey. And I love how you said that. I mean, what he's trying to convey is wisdom should be brought into conversation with Torah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is the message of this book,
Yeah.
because in the Old Testament, Proverbs does not really bring wisdom into substantial conversation with Torah, nor does Ecclesiastes.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, we're gonna start with the prologue, even though he didn't write it, but
The grandson wrote it.
yes, but it's
prologue.
important because it's gonna do something that's kind of vital for people who want to know how the Old Testament came together as canon.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. So I'm just gonna read a little bit of it. Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them, and for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now, notice the tripartite separation of books: the law, Torah, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the others. And if you read, for example, Jesus, he comes along and he says, what you said in Moses and the prophets, and so one time he says the Psalms.
The Psalms, right? Yeah.
And the implication is there's three sections that are in their minds, but it doesn't seem to be clearly laid out. The others is very vague, right? It's almost like it's maybe a little still in flux, that the final corpus, especially that last section, is not clearly confined yet. And so, but Torah seemed to be established.
Yeah.
Prophets seem to be established, and then this third section.
Right.
And we say prophets, for those who don't know, that includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That's what they call the former prophets. And then what we think of as the prophets are the rest of them.
Yep.
And so it's just kind of fascinating, like, insight into where the canon seems to be, or at least their understanding of it so far. Like what we call Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketubim. He doesn't call it Ketubims. Ketubim. He just calls it The others.
The others.
Yeah. And he uses this this throughout. So a little bit later, he says the law of prophets and the other books of our ancestors. And it's just a really interesting, like I said, look into it.
In the course of a 35-verse prologue, he uses the phrase, the law, the prophets, and the other books 3 times.
Yeah.
Which, so that's it's not just a passing reference. Like Jesus maybe one time says, the law, the prophets, and Psalms.
Right.
That's okay, that's one way of doing it, and he does it once. But here is in a very confined space, 3 times repeated, law, prophets, and the others. Yeah. That's this huge kind of canonical landmark. By the time this was written, and like you said, in the early 2nd century, there is a sense of a threefold Jewish canon. Yeah. And 2 of which are pretty solidified. One that's kind of amorphous, right? They're wondering which are the others that are going to get included or excluded. And it's not clearly defined.
Yep. So let's get into it. I think, like I said, it reads much like the Proverbs. It's going to offer little nuggets of advice, mostly in proverbial form. And at the end, there's some other things that go on.
Can I say one more thing about the prologue that I find interesting?
Please do.
He does this, and this is something I like to say whenever I begin teaching Hebrew, when I'm teaching Hebrew courses. He comments about the nature of translation, which I find interesting. He says, you are invited to read it with goodwill and attention and to be indulgent in cases where we may seem to have rendered some phrase imperfectly, despite our diligent labor in translating it. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have the same exact effect when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophets, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original.
So great.
To me, that's just a classic statement about, the challenge of translation, and, and why, Sam and I have this preference for the Hebrew Old Testament and not the Septuagint as someone else in the room.
The listener does not know that John just shot me this glance out of the corner of his eye. Do you want that knife back, or should I just leave it there?
And why Jerome had this preference for the Hebrew.
Yeah,
right?
yes,
so,
he did.
These sentiments are there from the very beginning. Anyway, so carry on.
No, love that. That was worth the interlude.
Right.
And worth hurting poor Ron's feelings.
I'll get over
He
it.
took it well.
So I'm just going to, I don't know, there's his thing. I've got like 10 minutes. Like 10 minutes to distill all that. And there's so many really good, like Proverbs. You can't what's your favorite Proverbs? Well, we'll be here an hour, right? So we're going to do the best we can. Let me just start with 1:1. All wisdom is from the Lord, and with him it remains forever. This is a pretty common sentiment, right? They understand that that's how it works, that like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and all these things. Like it's all coming from God. And then we look at verse 4. Wisdom was created before all other things, and prudent understanding from eternity. So, what does that sound like? Quiz time. Wisdom was created before all other things. This is not you, John. This is a Ron quiz.
No, because this is it makes me think of. Of course, you put me on the spot, so I can't remember the passage in the New Testament where it talks about Jesus' pre-existence. I know, like, there are some people want to put this in John chapter 1.
Sure.
And I absolutely disagree with that. I think that's a totally wrong way of reading John chapter 1.
Totally disagree with your disagreement.
Yep,
Yes.
that's fine. We can have an argument about that sometime. Get a little bit of Hebrews.
A little Colossians.
Colossians.
John 1, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1.
Yeah. I was thinking Hebrews. Colossians is the one I wasn't thinking of.
Right. So the New Testament writers pick up on it. But what they're also picking up on is Proverbs 8, right? Where it says this very thing, where it's personifying wisdom.
Yeah.
I was there at the beginning. I was basically the way in which the world was created. And so it conveys wisdom as being created long ago first, kind of a co-partner with God in the creation of the rest of the world, which then gets applied to Jesus on some level. We can have a debate about that at another time.
Exactly.
And the whole Greek Stoic tradition with the Logos.
Which I reject.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just got to get that in there, which I reject.
You can't reject that it exists and does
I'm
something
rejecting
extremely analogous.
I'm rejecting the idea that it influenced John in any way or John chapter 1.
So, pop down to verse 14 of chapter 1.
I'm glad.
Oh, boy.
Sure, John, glad to have you speak for him.
Oh, my gosh. You too.
Oh, wow. Sam, I'm sending it over to you because this could get off the rails really
Verse
fast.
14 of chapter 1. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
That's
She is
familiar.
created with the faithful in the womb. Yes, it sounds very familiar. That's what I'm saying. Like, so
Yeah.
many of these things you find in here are just like right out of the Proverbs, the sentiments of it. Look at down in 2, 6 through 9. You can tell me if this doesn't sound a little familiar. Trust in him, and he will help you. Make your way straight, and hope in him.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you asked where he gets some of his things from. I think clearly the Proverbs.
Yeah.
That there's something he will tweak a little, or sometimes it seems very much word for word. But we see that very much so. Oh man, so much. I should have done more checking off of things. I do want to talk about some. I don't know. I'm going to bring in some things that are not very orthodox. Is that okay? We can do some of those verses.
Yeah,
There's
I think people are
Sample
going to
'em.
enjoy that.
I mean, that's all you can do with this book is sample different portions, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at 22 verse 3. It is disgrace to be the father of an undisciplined son. No problem.
Mhm.
And the birth of a daughter is a loss.
Oh yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
That hurts a little bit, right?
Yep.
And the same sort of idea comes in 42, 9 through 11. He says, and a daughter is a secret anxiety to her father, and worry over her robs him of sleep.
Well, that's true.
It's true, 100%.
Not saying
right?
that's wrong.
When she is young, for fear she may not marry, or if married, for fear she may be disliked, while a virgin, for fear she may be seduced and become pregnant in her father's house, or having a husband, for fear she may go astray, or though married, for fear she may be barren. Keep strict watch over a headstrong daughter, or she may make you a laughingstock to your enemies, a byword in the city of the assembly of the people, and put you to shame in the public gatherings. See that there is no lattice in her room, no spot that overlooks the approaches to the house. Do not let her parade her beauty before any
It's a
man. or
Rapunzel situation.
Yeah, it's like, and it kind of goes on and on. And it's just like, yeah, I actually, while it's a little chauvinistic, just a little, I resonate on some level having a daughter.
Yeah.
As do you both.
Yes.
And it's just like, it's not worse having a daughter. It just, for me, brings in all sorts of different things because of our culture.
I think that dads worry about their daughters more than their sons. I just think there's something about it. I can't explain it. I'm not saying I understand the psychology or the culture or anything like that. But dads worry about their daughters more than they worry about their sons. And I think the author just reflects that. He understands it. He does, at times, sounds very chauvinistic. I think that's true. But I can't disagree with the underlying sentiment.
Yeah. In the last episode, we talked about the book of Judith kind of conveying this high view of women, and that was really prominent among lots of Jewish writings. There is this other thread that does have things that kind of distinguish men and women in ways that make it seem like there's a lower view of women, a little bit of patriarchal chauvinism. So it's important to say that strand is in the Second Temple literature as well.
Correct. I will do one more on that theme. It's 25:24. And he says, from a woman, sin had its beginning, and because of her, we will all die. And it's that idea of sin came through Eve. And you're going to get the same idea actually in the New Testament, but Paul's
Kind of
going to
a
definitely...
1 Timothy 2 thing.
Right.
Yeah.
He's going to turn it on its head. And we talked about a whole episode about how he's not actually saying that necessarily. But again, that sentiment is definitely part of when they're interacting with.
Oh, and then in Romans, go the opposite way.
Yeah,
that
with
we've-
Adam.
It's all Adam.
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
Yeah, we all sinned and died in Adam.
Right.
So yeah, they're kind of both sides in the New Testament.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and just let you know that there are things like that make you think, yeah, I'm kind of glad it's not in the Bible. At the on the other hand, it's like it's still there's a lot of good stuff in there.
But I mean, it does help us understand the complexities of, early, first century BC, first century AD, the complexities of Jewish thinking. And there probably isn't a universal, this is the way all Jews thought, but there are divergent views.
Can I point out a theme, Sam?
Please, we got so many things.
I know one theme I think that comes out strong in this book is friendship.
Yes.
Which is lots of good proverbs about friendship. In fact, there's quite a bit in chapter 6, but I just
6 is a
glanced
good one.
across chapter 9, verse 10. Do not abandon old friends,
Mm-hmm.
for new ones cannot equal them. A new friend is like new wine. When it has aged, you will drink it with pleasure. And so just like a reflection on friendship and just the value of having these friends that have been with you over the years. And a new friend is nice. It tastes, it's kind of sweet, but an aged wine, like an aged friend, it's just a different level of a sensory experience that you enjoy.
Yeah, you mentioned 6. It's really good. Like I'll just read a couple from 6, verse 5. Pleasant speech multiplies friends, and a gracious tongue multiplies courtesies. Let those who are friendly with you be many, but let your advisors be 1 in 1,000. When you gain friends, gain them through testing, and do not trust them hastily. For their friends who are such when it suits them, but they will not stand by you in time of trouble. And just like, yep,
Fair weather friends.
that
Yeah,
is exactly
exactly.
right. And like, there's a lot of good stuff like that.
And
Um,
I love that ratio though. Like,
Yeah.
be careful who you take counsel from.
Yeah.
Like, be super discriminating. There should be few people that you give a certain kind of weight to what they have to say.
Yeah.
And some people in our society just, especially with the internet, like they give, they'll ignore the counsel of someone who's been with them their entire life because some internet personality did a video and said something in a tantalizing way, and they give great weight to it.
Yeah.
And so I think this is kind of a balance to that. Be careful. People you don't know saying stuff. They
Mhm.
shouldn't necessarily be your counselors.
I know you have a lot of afterlife verses there, but the idea of just what it's like is he continues the same sorts of themes, where basically their Sheol is still prevalent.
Yep.
There's not a resurrection really on the horizon. It's basically the reward is everyone knows what you did in this life.
Yeah.
And so it's for me that's interesting to see. Okay, we're still not quite there yet, but perhaps we're moving that direction,
Yeah.
especially when you think about Daniel.
Yeah,
and so
here in
forth.
the 2nd century, the notion of afterlife does crop up in several books, but we're not there yet. Like you said, early 2nd century, we're still talking mostly about the Sheol model. And since this is early 2nd century, we don't have resurrection. And it reminds us a lot of the Old Testament wisdom literature's view of afterlife. It's Sheol.
Yeah.
Except now this is translated into Greek, it's Hades.
But the benefit isn't what you experience, but it's the memory you leave behind. Like that's sort of the reward is that you will be remembered well, and other things go with that.
I'm going to do one more little theme, and then I think we need to talk about the ending and what goes on with that as we run out of time.
Like chapter 44 and following?
Yes.
Excellent.
The theme is kind of like wisdom in Israel's sacred traditions. So in chapter 24, it's actually called the praise of wisdom. And I just want to read a little bit starting verse 8. Then the creator of all things gave me a command, and my creator chose the place for my tent. He said, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance. Basically saying, I was wisdom. God says, go live among the Israelites, right? Before the ages, in the beginning, he created me. For all the ages, I shall not cease to be. Again, that idea of preexistence. In the holy tent, I ministered before him, and so I was established in Zion. Thus, in the beloved city, he gave me a resting place, and in Jerusalem, it was my domain. I took root in an honored people, in the portion of the Lord, his heritage. I grew tall like a cedar in Lebanon, like a cypress in the heights of Hermon, and on and on. It talks about how he grows and does these things. And then look at verse 23. Whoever obeys me will not be put to shame. Those who work with me will not sin. All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us as an inheritance for the congregations of Jacob. And here he makes a clear connection where, like, wisdom and law are not two different things. Yeah. I think he might even suggest that the law is kind of like the pinnacle of wisdom. Like, wise living can clearly be found in living out Torah and those sorts of things. And so, as you're talking about, that makes a clear connection that's vital for understanding how these sections work together, because you don't see it clearly in the actual biblical texts.
Yeah.
It's like Deuteronomy 4:6 kind of stuff.
Mhm.
You'll
Oh,
show your
definitely.
wisdom to the nations.
Exactly.
It reminds me of the New Testament, wisdom and Jesus are not two different things.
Mhm.
Jesus is
Yes.
the embodiment of wisdom. So what Sirach does with wisdom and Torah, the New Testament does with wisdom and Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Logos and Jesus or whatever. There's another one I want to read from because, a lot of this stuff is stuff you'll find in the Bible. And but there's something that you don't have a lot in the Bible that this one does talk about. So here I'm talking at chapter 38 about physicians and health.
Mm-hmm.
Honor physicians for their services, for the Lord created them. For their gift of healing comes from the Most High, and they are rewarded by the King. The skill of physicians makes them distinguished, and in the presence of the great they are admired. The Lord created medicines out of the earth, and the sensible will not despise them. Was not water made sweet with a tree in order that its power might be known? And he gave skill to human beings that he might be glorified in his marvelous works. By them the physician heals and takes away pain. The pharmacist makes a mixture from them. God's works will never be finished, and from him health spreads over all the earth. So just a reflection on like human medicine, like, as a gift from God.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
this capacity to use the natural elements of the earth and bring them together into concoctions that make us better. Like this is a gift from God. Take advantage of it. Because there have been certain strands of Christians throughout history who've been like, nope, if God's going to heal me, he's going to do
Right.
it.
Right. Exactly.
I'm not going to the doctor. And so I thought this was an interesting kind of reflection that we didn't really have much of this in the Old Testament
No,
wisdom.
That's correct. And what's fascinating is that it continues in the rest of 38 into other chapters, in chapter 39 about, it's called, he's going to talk about lots of different trades that people undertake, and he's going to describe them. But all of it is inferior to being a scribe, is his point.
Yes.
What this ends up being is a big advertisement of like, you could do lots of things in your life. For him, it's be all you can be a scribe. Right. And it's kind of a hilarious sort of, I mean, it's not intended to be hilarious, but he's just saying they're all fine and good. But I mean, really, the best thing you can do with your life is be like me and be a scribe. It's just a funny little interlude there, a commercial.
Churches need to read this and then apply it to ministry.
I agree.
All sorts of things. But the world needs churches. It needs new churches. It needs church planters. It needs ministers. It needs missionaries.
Yeah.
Be a nice parallel.
Right. So all that leads up to chapter 44. And it's this, he begins by saying, you need to praise men. He says, let us now sing the praises of famous men, our ancestors in their generations, which is very unique because usually in the Old Testament, you praise God and not men.
Yeah.
In fact, even we last episode, we talked about Judith, and Judith's like, well, God did it all, right? And so it's just kind of interesting. And perhaps this is a little bit of Hellenistic influence where they did a lot of that. There's a Greek genre literature called the encomium, in which they actually do focus on people, especially deceased people. It's like an extended eulogy. And some are arguing that that's what this is on some level. And so we can talk about that a little bit, but it's just an interesting thing where he just goes through and he just names off all these people praised from the Bible: Enoch, Abraham, Noah, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Caleb, the judges. And they're like a snippet of their lives, kind of like the best of the hits, right, of these people, that puts it in this little poem that goes through. And so it's kind of like a history lesson and also a praise, like it ignores some of their flaws, and all just to say, I think in the end that God's the one doing it, but it is definitely praising men and not God overtly.
And it's worth, seeing which ones get more press.
Yeah.
There's a ton about Aaron and a ton about Phinehas, which is not necessarily thought of as a prominent figure in the Old Testament, but because they're priests, and this is the Second Temple period, and the priesthood is the main kind of institution that's providing leadership and guidance for that period. And so these people are lifted and given more attention. They're given like the equivalent of like 10 paragraphs, and normally you get like a half a paragraph.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But in there's nothing that's really causes a great deal of anxiety about faith. It's just sort of how they viewed their ancestors in the most positive sort of way. And I would say that about most of Ben Sira. That I don't read through it and say, "Oh my gosh, this is awful. This is anti-Bible." Like, no, it's taking what is pretty standard understanding of wisdom and law and saying, "Yep, we should be better people and live these things out, and things would go better for us."
It's interesting that whole section kind of ends biblically with Josiah and other worthies, kind of like wrapped up in chapter 49. Just hits several people. And then there's kind of one last one in chapter 50 where we go to Simon, son of Onias.
Right.
Which is, you'll learn about when we talk about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, but a pivotal priest during the intertestamental period is the last name on the list. So most of them are from the Old Testament until you get to Simon.
And some scholars have suggested that's the point, is that they're going to laud these other figures that you're on board with because they're part of your tradition. And then the climax is, oh, by the way, Simon is in the same sort of group, even though he's not in the Bible, and so you should laud him as well for all he's done. Some scholars suggest that's what's going on.
A little apologetic.
Kind of, yeah.
For Simon and his high priesthood.
Yeah.
Which was being challenged in that time period.
For sure. Who knows?
This section really stands out to me as well because it does what no Old Testament wisdom book does, which is talks about the people in the salvation history, Israelite characters. They are just not named in the book of Proverbs.
Right.
And here you have poems, Proverbs written about Old Testament figures. So there's this blend of salvation history and the wisdom tradition that is unique. And so arguably this one this wisdom book is almost more orthodox in its
Yes.
engagement of salvation history and its emphasis on Torah. It's actually more Jewish sounding than Ecclesiastes and Proverbs.
Yeah, and some people actually said they prefer Ecclesiasticus over Ecclesiastes in the Bible. I think it's a little much, but I mean, I've heard that said.
Yeah, they're doing two fundamentally different things.
Yeah.
All right, shall we move on to the next one?
We want to end on time, yes.
All right. So my job is to talk a little bit about the wisdom of Solomon. If you have a copy of the Apocrypha, it actually comes before Ben Sira, which Sam introduced us to. And we do it second because chronologically it's later. Like Ben Sira, it was written in Hebrew, early 2nd century. This book seems to be located in the time period of like the last century BC into the 1st century AD. Right, so it's chronologically later. Sam mentioned there are some Greek elements in Ben Sira, kind of starting to show a little bit more than we see in the Old Testament wisdom literature. The wisdom of Solomon is very Greek,
Yeah.
from beginning to end. Like taking Greek categories and Greek language and applying them to Jewish convictions and Jewish hopes. Something this book kind of gets into dualistic Greek philosophy, and because of its talk about immortality and things like that. I'm not convinced that's the case. I think it's using this language and kind of baptizing it or circumcising it into a Jewish framework, using their languages to talk about Jewish ideas.
Yeah, it's like Ben Sira is going to push back against Hellenization, and Wisdom of Solomon's almost going to like contextualizing their for new generation, a Greek generation. Yeah,
Is
I like the way you
wisdom-
talk about the baptizing, circumcising of it.
Is wisdom kind of leading up to like Philo of Alexandria? Like, is there a tradition of going from Wisdom of Solomon to Philo?
I don't know about that.
I don't either.
That's fine.
Philo crosses a line that the wisdom of Solomon doesn't.
Okay,
Um,
but that's what I'm saying. I'm wondering if there's a line though, like a trajectory. Like he's
Oh, yeah.
not doing what wisdom does, but wisdom sort of opens up a door that Philo walks through.
yeah, if you create a Hebrew thinking to Greek thinking spectrum, I think you would place wisdom in the middle, Ben Sira on the left of middle, right? And then Philo to the right of middle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's more what I was thinking. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So this book is a clear case of pseudonymity, and that is a book that purports to be written by someone, but is clearly not written by that someone.
Yep.
This book frames itself as being a writing of Solomon, and there's a big chunk of this book where he talks about how he asked for wisdom and he prayed for it, and God gave it to him when he was king over Israel. Like, this is clearly taking on the persona of Solomon, but clearly not written by Solomon.
Yeah, and some of us would suggest it's like what Ecclesiastes does. Some of us, not everyone. But
Yeah, right. Yeah, and this kind of is an example of how in the time around Jesus, people thought about the practice of pseudonymity. Interestingly, and when you think about, well, if this is claimed to be written by Solomon but clearly isn't, it's a forgery, it's a fraud, it should be rejected. The first document that we have, the oldest document that is close to having a canon list, like a list of books, is called a Muratorian fragment. It's called a fragment because that's all we have is a fragment. And it's a list of all the books of the Bible. Like, it's an attempt to do this. And this book, this fragment is from the 2nd century. It's written in Latin. And it includes, and so this is a Christian document that's listing the books that they think are in the Christian Bible. Right? And so it has evidence of the Gospels in it, all the writings of Paul in it, probably all the writings of John. There's an allusion that probably encompasses the letters of John. And then it also includes the Apocalypse of Peter as part of it, and the Wisdom of Solomon.
interesting.
That the earliest canon list actually lists this not as part of the Old Testament,
Right.
but part of the New Testament. And yet it's a book that is overtly pseudonymous.
Right.
It's written in Greek. It is excellent Greek writing, kind of like the book of Hebrews is excellent Greek writing. It's clearly pseudonymous, and the early church represented by the Muratorian fragment has no problem saying, and this is canonical. And so pseudonymity is a practice that takes a bad name, has a bad rap. If you're suggesting someone, claims to have written this but didn't actually, then we can't trust it. We have to be suspicious. The early church thought a little bit differently about it. But deliberate forgeries, there's abundant evidence that the early church rejected deliberate forgeries.
Yeah,
So there's both sides.
No one's being fooled, right? They all know that Solomon didn't write it. Like that's the thing is like they all are on board with it. They get it's a tool, right? And so like they're fine with it. It's a vehicle to get a message across, and they're not like, oh well, this guy's clearly lying. Like no, they get it, and that's hard for us. I think our modern minds are like, well, if someone says it's this, then it's got to be that. Like, it's not how it works.
It's hard to get back into a first century way of thinking or second century, like
Or
the merge
ancient
way.
way. I mean, it's pseudonymity has been used in the ancient world a lot, and that's just what they do.
Yeah. And I have that little digression because I think when you read a Bible commentary and you read the introductory sections, most good commentaries will expose you to all the authorship theories.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them will say that certain books of the Bible are pseudonymous. And maybe Ecclesiastes is an example of that, right? Or a book of the New Testament might be pseudonymous. And when they're suggesting that, they're not doing something super liberal or anti-Bible, or they don't care about forgeries and anything goes. They're trying to reflect the ideas that were in the air at the time these books were composed and take seriously those possibilities as what might be going on. And in the history of scholarship is like once upon a time it was believed that everything in the Bible was written by the person whose name is on the book.
Right.
Right? And then like during the time of historical criticism, its early days, the assumption went the opposite way.
Yeah.
Nothing is written by anyone who claims to be written. And now, and both of those are on ideological grounds, right?
Right.
But now the pendulum has kind of shifted to where let's take each book on a case-by-case basis and let its internal testimony testify to who probably wrote it and when.
Right.
And with the possibility that pseudonymity is on the table and the possibility that, the person whose name is attached to is actually the one who wrote it. Like both possibilities are there. And both possibilities are equally orthodox from the mind of ancient writers, as long as there's not deliberate misleading, forgery, etc. So just big picture structure of this book. There are two major sections. The first half of the book, section A, is kind of like the first 10 chapters. And this is basic wisdom stuff. The first 6 chapters of part A is this a system of rewards and punishments, like for good behavior and righteousness, there are rewards, and for bad foolishness, there are punishments. Then in chapters 6 through 10, we have this praise of wisdom, similar to what you were referring to in Ben Sira, and there's equally kind of stoic ideas of in the beginning was wisdom, and through wisdom the world was created. That theme is there in Wisdom of Solomon as well as in Ben Sira, and then Proverbs 8, and possibly picked up in the New Testament. We'll leave that up to debate. But that happens. And then section B of the book is really a framing of wisdom ideas in terms of the events of the Exodus.
Yep.
It's like there are 7 sections that draw upon like the plagues and things that happen, the bad things that happen to wicked people, foolish people, in contrast to the good things that happen to righteous people. But it doesn't go through all of Israelite history. It's really, the emphasis is on the events surrounding the Exodus and the departure of Exodus culminating in the Red Sea. So there's this huge emphasis in chapters 11 through 19 on that event.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of a takedown of Egypt as well, like because that's the location of that. And I mean, I don't know. We can talk about what that might imply, but they definitely they're taking down that whole scene, Egypt and ancient Egypt. But what are the implications for modern Egypt? So.
Yeah, it's part of the reason some people think that this book was written from Egypt. Like this is a Jewish community in Egypt asserting their legitimacy as a well-educated wisdom community who believes in Torah.
Yeah.
And their opponents are going to be some of the highly Hellenized Egyptian folk who totally buy into Greek philosophy and reject the Jewish way of life as being archaic and undeveloped. So it's almost like an apologetic for the wisdom of the Jewish people that they have from their God.
Yeah.
But it's not grounded on really. We have this whole section where it's kind of like framed as this is the wisdom that Solomon had and that he chose, and that he prayed for, and that he was given. But then it pivots for the bulk of the book to focus on God's actions in salvation history to deliver his people from the Egyptians. You're going to say something, Ron?
Oh, it just made me think of some of the modern debates that I think modern Christians still face those same kinds of accusations that, we don't have the wisdom of the people around us, and that we are these sort of backwards, hick people who, you're not enlightened the way you should be. And so it's like the kinds of things that Wisdom of Solomon may be pushing back against are the kinds of things God's people always have to push back against.
Yeah. So I want to do a few samplings just to give a
Yep.
sense of how it reads. Sam, can you read the first chapter, first 15 verses? You kind of see how the book kicks off.
Certainly. Love righteousness, you rulers of the earth. Think of the Lord in goodness and seek him with sincerity of heart, because he is found by those who do not put him to the test, and manifests himself to those who do not distrust him. For perverse thoughts separate people from God, and when his power is tested, it exposes the foolish. Because wisdom will not enter a deceitful soul, or dwell in a body enslaved to sin. For a holy and disciplined spirit will flee from deceit, and will leave foolish thoughts behind, and will be ashamed of the approach of unrighteousness. For wisdom is a kindly spirit, but will not free blasphemers from the guilt of their words, because God is a witness of their inmost feelings, and a true observer of their hearts, and a hearer of their tongues. Because the Spirit of the Lord has filled the world, and that which holds all things together knows what is said. Therefore, those who utter unrighteous things will not escape notice, and justice, when it punishes, will not pass them by. For inquiry will be made into the counsels of the ungodly, and report of their words will come to the Lord, to convict them of their lawless deeds. Because a jealous ear hears all things, and the sound of grumbling does not go unheard. Beware, then, of useless grumbling, and keep your tongue from slander, because no secret word is without result, and a lying mouth destroys the soul. Am I going through 15?
Yep.
Do not invite death by the error of your life, or bring on destruction by the works of your hands. Because God did not make death. He does not delight in the death of the living, for he created all things that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them. And the dominion of Hades is not on earth, for righteousness is immortal.
Yeah. So this just sets up, I think, a theme of the book that frames the entire book as the two ways.
Yeah.
Righteousness and wickedness, which is kind of like wisdom and folly. And like this whole earth, this realm, it's of God. He made it. There's a way to live in it, and it's the right way, and God rewards that way. And so the first section is going to kind of talk about that in general, right? And talk about the way of righteousness versus the way of the wicked, the fruit of the one, the fruit of the other, how Solomon, when given a chance to have anything, chose wisdom, and he chose righteousness, and God gave that to him. And so this is kind of how the whole book is framed. But there is an interesting section that I think is almost a critique of Ecclesiastes. Or at least it's framed as life as the ungodly see it, but you could see it as a critique of some of the sentiments in Ecclesiastes. You want to read that, Ron? Just start in verse 16. Maybe just go through 5, and we'll kind of pause there.
Wait a minute.
116.
116. Sorry about that. But the ungodly by their words and deeds summoned death, considered him a friend, they pined away and made a covenant with him, because they are fit to belong to his company. For they reasoned unsoundly, saying to themselves, short and sorrowful is our life, and there is no remedy when a life comes to its end, and no one has been known to return from Hades. For we were born by mere chance, and hereafter we shall be as though we never had never been. For the breath in our nostrils is smoke, and reason is a spark kindled by the beating of our hearts. And when it is extinguished, the body will turn to ashes, and the spirit will dissolve like empty air. Our name will be forgotten in time, and no one will remember our works. Our life will pass away like the traces of a cloud, and be scattered like mist that is chased by the rays of the sun and overcome by its heat. For our allotted time is the passing of a shadow, and there is no return from our death, because it is sealed up, and no one turns back.
Sam, you want to talk about the Ecclesiastes parallels there?
Well, yeah, this idea of So what you do on earth doesn't matter. When you die, it all just goes away, right? And so you can be as good as you want or as bad as you want, and death is the great equalizer. And so it's kind of like this idea of no one comes back from Hades once you go down, and your name's going to be forgotten. No one's going to care, and there's no return. So he doesn't say this, but Ecclesiastes says, so what's the point?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like he's hinting at it, but not quite going there.
It's a very
especially-
nihilistic way of looking at things.
Yeah, and the big refrain of Ecclesiastes is meaningless, meaningless,
Right, yeah.
which is like in Hebrew, havel, havelim, which is like emptiness, emptiness, or mist, mist,
Yes.
or like in this language of like this thing that is meaningless because it is fleeting and cannot be
Yeah.
grasped. It's insubstantial, and that exact language is here, right? We'll be scattered like mist, chased away by the rays of the sun. Like nothing stays the same.
Yep.
And it goes on to define life as the ungodly see it, to say in verse 6, "Come therefore, let us enjoy the good things that exist, and make use of creation to the full as in youth." And so let us take our fill of costly wine and perfumes, and let no flower of spring pass us by, which reminds you of the constructive advice of Ecclesiastes.
Right.
Since it's all fleeting, enjoy it, right? Enjoy it while it's here. Enjoy the wife of your youth. Enjoy food. Enjoy your time together. And so it's this kind of critique of the ungodly who seem to think there's no meaning in life. So you just enjoy the good stuff of the world, because Ecclesiastes, Wisdom of Solomon is going to have a view of afterlife,
Right.
or at least think that in God there's an equalizing, there's a just, there is a quest for future for the godly, and it's worth it. It's worth it to live the way of Torah, and we can't go into that. But in chapter 3, there's the destiny of the righteous, which is clearly different than the destiny of the unrighteous, which Ecclesiastes doesn't believe. And I don't think Ecclesiastes per se is the target of this book, but the sentiments expressed in Ecclesiastes are definitely, seen here. And so there is a wisdom debate going on between the two books, which I think both books would welcome that conversation. So that's some interesting section there. I thought chapter 5 is kind of interesting. We have a little armor of God section.
Yep.
5:17 through 20. You want to read that, Sam?
The Lord will take his zeal as his whole armor, and will arm all creation to repel his enemies. He will put on a righteousness as a breastplate, and wear impartial justice as a helmet. He will take holiness as an invincible shield, and sharpen stern wrath for a sword. And creation will join with him to fight against his frenzied foes.
Yeah. So much different than Paul's version.
Yeah.
But similar.
Of the armor of God, but there is definitely some overlap here.
Yeah.
Another key section I want to highlight is chapter 10. This is the last chapter of the first section of the book, of the first half. And it's wisdom. It's kind of telling the story of Israel in wisdom terms, but the main character in the story is wisdom, and the familiar Israelite characters are not named.
Right.
So you want to start reading that,
Allusions.
Ron? And we won't read the whole thing, but at least we'll kind of sample from chapter 10.
No problem. Wisdom protected the first formed father of the world when he alone had been created. She delivered him from his transgression and gave him strength to rule all things. But when an unrighteous man departed from her in his anger, he perished, because in rage he killed his brother. When the earth was flooded because of him, wisdom again saved it, steering the righteous man by a paltry piece of wood. Wisdom also, when the nations in wicked agreement had been put to confusion, recognized the righteous man and preserved him blameless before God, and kept him strong in the face of his compassion for his child. Wisdom rescued a righteous man when the ungodly were perishing. He escaped the fire that descended on the 5 cities. Evidence of their wickedness still remains, a continually smoking wasteland, plants bearing fruit that does not ripen, and a pillar of salt, standing as a monument to an unbelieving soul.
Okay, great.
Got
So here we have from Adam through Noah to Abraham and Lot and his wife,
Right.
all told, and no mention of anyone's name, because the star in the story is wisdom.
Right.
It's just a cool poem, and it ends with the events of the Exodus and the Red Sea. Because again, this whole book is pointing toward the Exodus event and Egypt. And so that's how this chapter is kind of a hinge to part 2 of the book, which is literally going to be 7 sections that talk about 7 events that contrast the fate of the righteous and the fate of the wicked, but in terms of the events of the Exodus and the aftermath. And there's a kind of a giant digression where it talks about the ways of Israel's God and the folly of idols.
Mhm.
It kind of there's a few chapters that depart from the 7 events related to the Exodus to kind of reflect on the folly of idolatry. But I do want to sample at least one section of how part 2 talks about. I think we'll do the first one. How it talks about events from the Exodus and the Red Sea. So I'll start with chapter 11. Wisdom prospered their works by the hand of a holy prophet. They journeyed through an uninhabited wilderness and pitched their tents in untrodden places. They withstood their enemies and fought off their foes. When they were thirsty, they called upon you, and water was given to them out of a flinty rock, and from the hard stone a remedy for their thirst. For though through the very things by which their enemies were punished, they themselves received the benefit of their need. Instead of a fountain of an ever-flowing river, stirred up and defiled with blood, in rebuke for the decree to kill the infants, you gave them abundant water unexpectedly, showing by their thirst at the time how you punished their enemies. So I'll stop there. So you kind of have the God's plague on the infants of Israel contrasted with the water from the rock that God gave that sustained the Israelites.
Yeah.
And that contrast between how God provided generously for the Israelites in the Exodus, and it goes into Numbers too, is contrasted with what the Egyptians experienced at the hand of God in the plagues and the armies that went against Israel, what they experienced. So the whole rest of the book, 7 sections contrasting the fate of the righteous, specifically righteous Israelites, versus the fate of the wicked, specifically wicked Egyptians. And that's how the book goes on to end. And so like Ben Sira, it's wisdom. It's framed like wisdom. You got the short poems. You've got the poetic style. But it is directly in conversation with key figures in Israel's history and really the story of salvation history.
So,
Thoughts about it?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely reframing and retelling of the history for a certain purpose, and it's a reminder, like we talked about with with Judith, that God's still working through circumstances, and the person who wants to be part of that is going to live a certain way and is going to embrace wisdom. And so, I find it. I don't like it as much as Ben Sira, but it's still a lot of really kind of interesting things. I probably don't like it as much because it's more Greekish. That's my bias coming out, but that's the way it goes.
Wow.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us in this week's episode of The Last Homely House.
What happened here?
I went to
first of all, Ron, I was asking you what you thought of Wisdom of Solomon.
Oh, I
and
thought you were
like
asking
shutting down the episode. We'll
No.
retake or shut down.
Yeah, take it as me totally screwing up because I went to the other podcast
Yeah.
I'm doing. I am
Other
embarrassed.
podcast also.
I'm embarrassed.
What did you think of the Wisdom of Solomon?
You know what? The thing about the wisdom literature is it just doesn't grab me as much as the history literature. That's my thing with it. I think it's interesting. Like there's some wisdom in Solomon that shows up in Romans. Maybe. That's debatable. But it doesn't grab me as much as some of the history stuff. So, man, I'm sorry. I screwed up so bad that I'm just like off the rails now, and I'm having a hard time getting myself back on the rails.
But this parallels my botched ending from a couple of weeks ago. So.
That's right, yeah. We each have our stuff. So, Sam, you're up. You got a botch and ending up here
I'll do
pretty
what I
soon.
can.
Yeah.
My final thoughts about this book is I like it as an attempt to bring wisdom ideas in conversation with Jewish convictions.
Yeah.
In a way that's in conversation with later contemporary culture and its wisdom.
Yeah.
So I love the way it does that. Old Testament wisdom just doesn't go that other step into bringing the story of Israel into the concept of wisdom the way it does. And I think the New Testament picks up by doing that, as identifying Jesus with the wisdom of God and incorporating the concept of wisdom into salvation history, culminating in Jesus. So I think this is on a trajectory that culminates in Jesus as the wisdom of God. And so I find it a helpful bridge.
Yeah.
So let's try this ending
Take
again.
2.
Let's do that again. Somebody else start it off, though.
Thanks for joining us this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen
After class.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist. Social media is managed by Darren Harris.